In the foothills of Olympus, where eagles nest among the clouds, there lived a woman named Olympias. Her beauty was said to have been sculpted by the gods themselves, her spirit as untamable as the mountain winds. When she walked, the earth trembled, not in fear, but in reverence. For Olympias was no ordinary mortal. She was a queen, the last queen of the kingdom of Macedon before it became an empire, and soon she would be the mother of a god. Her story, though, begins not in the lap of luxury, but in the belly of a beast. The oracle had warned her father, King Neoptolemus, that she would bring either great glory or utter ruin upon their house. And so, to protect his dynasty, he did the unthinkable. He chained Olympias inside a bronze chest, bearing her alive until she bore her child, cut off from the world, cut off from life itself. But Olympias was no ordinary woman. As the sun set each day, she would claw at the walls of her tomb, and each night she spoke to the stars, her voice echoing with the pain of a caged goddess, and the gods heard her. Moved by her plight, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, came to her in a dream and told her, "When you hear the rooster crow 3 times, break free from your prison. You have a kingdom to run and a legacy to fulfill." And then one fateful day, when the rooster's crow sliced through the morning calm, Olympias burst from her tomb, forever marked by her ordeal. But her story doesn't end there. She went on to marry King Philip, uniting 2 kingdoms and birthing a son who would change the world, Alexander. Under her watchful eye, he grew up hearing tales of his mother's courage and his father's valor, preparing him for the destiny that awaited him. But while she loved her son with every fiber of her being, she also knew that his destiny lay beyond math. And when the time came for him to leave, she stood at the crossroads, watching him go, knowing that she might never see him again. Meanwhile, on the sun-drenched island of Crete, nestled in the heart of the Mediterranean, lay the ruins of a magnificent city, once home to a people who worshipped a mighty bull god. This was Knossos, the beating heart of the Minoan civilization, but now it was a shadow of its former self, its grand palaces reduced to crumbling stones, and its glorious past buried under layers of dust and debris. Yet beneath the ruins, whispers lingered, tales of a great flood that had washed away an entire civilization. Some said it was divine retribution, others a natural disaster, but all agreed that nothing had ever been the same since the water had receded, leaving behind only fragments of what once was. It was here in the Labyrinth of Knossos that archaeologists unearthed the secrets of a bygone era. Among the shards of pottery and the bones of sacrificed animals, they found evidence of a society that had thrived on trade and cultural exchange. The Minoans had been masters of their world, their influence stretching from the Egyptian pharaohs to the Greek cities. But like all great empires, their time in the sun was destined to end, and when it did, it ended abruptly and violently. The true tale of Knossos remains shrouded in mystery, but the ruins speak for themselves. Here in this desolate landscape, entire frescoes depicting mythical beasts and human sacrifice lay scattered and torn from their walls and trampled underfoot. What were these images trying to tell us? And what horrors had they witnessed before their destruction? What secrets did they hold that the destroyers wanted erased? And why were they so intent on erasing them? These questions echo through the ages, unanswered, leaving us to piece together the puzzle of Knossos and the fate of its people. From the heights of Macedon to the depths of Crete, Olympias watched over her domain, shaping its destiny with a blend of wisdom and ruthlessness. For her, power was not just a means to rule, it was a shield against the chaos that threatened to engulf her world. Like a serpent, she shed her enemies' attacks, using their own weapons against them. And as the legend goes, when she entered a room, heads turned and hearts skipped a beat. Not because she demanded a doa, but because she commanded respect. She understood the language of power, the subtle cues, the unspoken threats, and she wielded that understanding like a finely honed blade. In a world where men often sought to dominate, Olympias found her strength in strategy and wit. She knew that true power lay not just in brute force, but in knowing when to strike and how to shatter an opponent's defenses without laying a hand on them. She returned to Macedon at the head of an army, and the moment her feet touched home soil, everything changed. Towns opened their gates, soldiers defected, even enemies hesitated. Olympias, despite her age, was still a name that shook the ground. Then came vengeance. She hunted down the loyalists of Cassandra. She caught Philip III, Aridaeus Alexander's half-brother, and ordered his execution. His wife, Eurydice, refused suicide. Olympias had her strangled, brutality cloaked in royal decorum, her justice theatrical, her message on the Alexander's bloodline had the right to rule. For one burning moment, she held the kingdom in her grip. But power in Macedon was dry grass. Cassandra returned stronger, colder, her allies faded. She retreated to the fortress of Pydna, and then the siege began. This is the story of Olympias, mother of Alexander the Great. After Alexander's death, his mother Olympias lived in exile in Pella. But when news reached her that Cassandra had seized the throne and had even murdered her grandson, Alexander II, Olympias couldn't just sit and watch. At the ripe age of 65, Olympias took up arms. With the help of her brother, she raised a mercenary army and marched on Pella. The very sight of the returning queen sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Towns surrendered without a fight. Gates that were once closed to her were now open. The people who once shouted for Cassandra to take the throne now shouted for Olympias to take it back. It was as if the 7 years of Cassandra's rule had been a bad dream, a nightmare that ended the moment Olympias set foot on Macedonian soil. But Olympias wasn't done. She wanted more than just the throne. She wanted revenge. Her first target was Philip III, Alexander's half-brother, whom Cassandra had made regent. He had taken the title of king, but Philip had no intention of ruling. When Olympias approached him with an army, he surrendered without a fight. As for Alexander II's father, Cassandra had executed him, so there was nothing left for Olympias except to avenge his death. That was also the reason why she spared Philip's life. She paraded him around cities that had submitted to Cassandra, reminding them of his treachery, calling him a usurper and a traitor before they killed him. Next, Olympias turned her attention to Eurydice, the widow of Alexander II, who was living in the royal palace in Pella. She offered Eurydice a choice, either commit suicide or die by hanging. When Eurydice chose the former, Olympias had the so-called queen mother had arrived back in Macedon, and she was going to rest until all her enemies were dead. Meanwhile, Cassandra had fled to the north. The general who had betrayed Olympias and brought his son Alexander to his death was now hiding like a rat, desperately raising new armies to defeat his queen. He did not want to accept the defeat that had been handed to him. He wanted to remind Macedon who was really in charge, and Olympias knew this. That's why she didn't kill him immediately. She wanted him to suffer. She wanted him to know that every step he took, every move he made, was under her watchful eye. In fact, she wanted him to feel her presence in every city he captured, every battle he won, every life he took. So Olympias went on a tour of the kingdom, visiting the cities that had suffered because of Cassandra, consoling the widows and orphans, healing the sick and the wounded. Wherever she went, she reminded the people that Olympias was back and Cassandra's time was over. It seemed as if she was unstoppable. Even her enemies had to acknowledge her power. Antipater, the general who had led Alexander's army to victory at the Battle of Gaugamela, now led the forces of Cassandra. And even he had to admit that Olympias was a force to be reckoned with. He knew that he couldn't defeat her in battle, so he tried to avoid it. But Olympias was relentless. She kept moving from town to town, gathering support, training soldiers, watching Cassandra's men from afar. And then the moment came when she felt ready. She turned to her brother and said, "It's time." Together, they raised their armies and marched on Cassandra's capital. But they weren't prepared for what they found. Cassandra had fled. The city was empty. The only people who remained were those loyal to Olympias. Suddenly, the tables were turned. Those who had welcomed Olympias as their savior were now prisoners in their own homes. Olympias could have executed them all, but she didn't. Instead, she let them go with a warning. When Cassandra returned, he found a kingdom in chaos. What had happened to Olympias? Where was her army? Why had her soldiers abandoned their posts? What had become of the invincible Olympia? But Cassandra didn't care about any of that. He had come for one thing, to punish those who had betrayed him. He seized the treasury, arrested the merchants, confiscated the property of the nobles, and even put some of Olympias' generals on trial for treason. In the end, only one city remained loyal to Olympias, her hometown of Pydna, but even there, supplies were running low and her soldiers were getting restless. The once invincible Olympias was now trapped in a fortress with a handful of soldiers, waiting for the inevitable. And when the siege began, she knew that this was the end. Her army was defeated, her allies had deserted her, her enemies were at the gates. This time, there would be no escape. Thank you for watching. Behind these towering walls, a queen defied an empire. Her name was Olympias, daughter of Neoptolemus, granddaughter of Achilles, the demigod. When her father died, Olympias took over the kingdom, but her neighbors didn't respect that. The Aetolian League invaded, forcing her to flee to the port city of Pul. There she raised an army and turned the tables. Olympias crushed her enemies and their king, but not before he cursed her. "May your own subjects rise against you," he said, "and you die a miserable death." Her own people revolted, forcing her to flee to the sanctuary of Athena, but Olympias was no quitter. With the help of the god Apollo, she built a new city, which she named after herself, Olympia. Here she lived out her days in peace, or so you'd think. Meanwhile, across the Aegean, Cassander had become the hegemon of the Macedonian Empire. His grandfather was Antipater, one of Alexander the Great's friends, and Cassander's ambition was to become the ruler of all Greece. He conquered Epirus, but Olympias was a thorn in his side. She ruled this small corner of Greece with the backing of two superpowers, the Egyptian Ptolemaic Kingdom and the Seleucid Empire. Plus she was a constant pain, launching raids into Cassander's territory. He wanted her gone. In 253 BC, Cassander laid siege to Olympia. For nearly a year, Olympias held out. Food ran short. Disease crept in. But within the walls, she remained a presence carved from divine wrath. Even in isolation, she stood like the mother of a god, watching her enemies from atop the citadel, waiting for them to break. And when they did, it wasn't because they starved, or because they got sick. Her followers surrendered. But Olympias, ever unbending, was handed to her enemies. Cassander didn't kill her. He offered her a choice, safety in exchange for surrender. She refused. Cassander didn't kill her. Instead, he had her paraded through the streets of her own city, a captive audience of people she once ruled. Then he brought her to the families of those she'd executed. They condemned her to death, but none dared to strike the blow. There was no ceremony, no crown, only dust, and thus the Serpent Queen died. But history doesn't forget women like her, does it? History remembers Olympias, the woman who wouldn't bend, even when death stared her in the face. And how can it not? Her story is written in stone hinges, etched onto the coins of her very own empire. She was born to rule, and she did. Even if it was over a small corner of Greece. Here's what we know about her from these coins. On the obverse, there's a portrait of Olympias wearing a diadem. That's a headband that signified royalty. Next to it, the legend reads Basilios, which means queen. This was minted during her war with Cassander. To put it on a coin was like having a voodoo doll. By jingling these coins, Olympias could hear the sound of her power. This coin was minted after she took refuge in the temple of Athena. It shows her kneeling before the goddess, holding a scepter and a veil. The reverse shows Athena in her temple, holding a spear and a shield. Around them are the words that tell us when this happened. 252 BC. We also have this coin minted by Herale Ptolemy II, who ruled Egypt. On the obverse he appears next to his wife. They both wear the traditional Egyptian crown, and on the reverse, we see the goddess of victory holding a wreath. This alliance with Egypt reminds us that Olympias wasn't alone, that even when her own people sold her out, she still had friends. These coins tell us about Olympias, the ruler, the warrior, the queen who never surrendered. But what about the woman behind the diadem? We don't know much about her. History has been kind to men like Ptolemy and Cassander. Their love affairs, their intrigues, their battles, all well documented. But what do we know about Olympias? Nothing really. Did she have a say in ruling her domain? Did she ever dream of a larger kingdom? What did she do in her spare time? Unfortunately, these questions will never be answered. All we have are these coins, silent witnesses to a glorious past. Remnants of an era when queens like Olympias weren't just ruling beside kings, they were ruling in their own right. Thanks for watching. When you think of Alexander the Great, you think of a god among men. You think of invincibility. You think of a kid who took an empire from his father and turned it into a legend in just 11 years. You also think of Olympias, his mother, a woman so fierce she could start a war with a glare. This is the story of Olympias, Alexander's mother. This is not a footnote to Alexander's story. Olympias was no ordinary woman. She wasn't a general who followed her husband to wars. She wasn't even a queen who sat on a throne. She was something Look around. Her battlefield was not the open field. It was the goblet, the temple, the oracle. Her weapon of choice was not the sword or the shield. It was belief. The belief in her son, in the stories she told. And if that sounds like magic, well, you're not wrong. She was a force of nature. Without her, there is no Alexander myth, no divine child, no thunderbolt rituals, no undefeated general. She made people believe Alexander was a god, and maybe she believed it herself. Olympias wanted power, and she took it. Kings called her a witch, a murderer, a manipulator. And those titles have stuck, but they're incomplete. She was all those things and more. She played the game of kings and played it better than most, crueler than most, more cleanly than most, but undeniably. She was born a princess, the daughter of King Knossos. When Olympias met Philip, he was just another contender for the throne of Macedon, but she saw something in him, something worth believing in, something worth manipulating, a way to bring about her own rise to power. So she nudged him towards the throne, and then she helped him secure it. Once Philip was king, Olympias gave him two heirs, a daughter and a son, Cleopatra and Alexander. But Philip had other children, too, many other children, and Olympias knew her children would have to be extraordinary to secure their place in the kingdom. So she sent them to be raised by the oracle at Delphi, far from the intrigues of the court, far from the dangers of other nobles, but not far from the stories that would make them larger than life, the stories that would make them gods. She told them tales of the Diadochi, of the great deeds of their ancestors, of the battles they fought and the monsters they slew. She fed them stories of heroism and valor, stories that made Philippa and Alexander who they were. When Philip was murdered, Olympias wasted no time in securing her son's claim to the throne. She raised an army and marched on Pella. No one stood against her. She was unstoppable. She was the mother of a god. She was Olympias, the most powerful woman in Macedonia. This is our channel, and if you want to see more stories like this, you know what to do. Hi everyone. On the island of Crete, just south of the modern city of Heraklion, lies a dream carved in stone. Corridors snake in all directions. Rooms twist. Staircases go nowhere. It's a confusing jumble of passages and chambers, and at the center of it all is a courtyard with a well in the middle. This is Knossos, the supposed birthplace of the Labyrinth. Knossos was the heart of Minoan civilization, a palace like no other. Built around 1900 BCE, it was a city under one roof, over 1,000 rooms, air shafts to keep it cool, running water from pipes that were built into the walls, flush toilets, and those are just the things that we can see. To ancient visitors it must have felt like magic. The palace was abandoned around 1450 BCE, probably because of a natural disaster, maybe an earthquake. Then the sea level rose and swallowed the Minoans' greatest city. It was lost until 1900, when the British archaeologist Arthur Evans uncovered it. He found the Minoans' greatest treasure, their most precious metal, not gold but this elephant tusks. See, the Minoans had no metal tools. They carved everything out of stone, but they needed metal for their bull imagery, so they imported it. That's how Evans knew he'd found the labyrinth. Because, look, the bull was a sacred animal to them. Remember the story of Theseus and the Theseus slays the monster and then he gets lost in the labyrinth. Right. Well, the labyrinth is supposed to be here, and the only way to get lost is if you follow the bulls. Evans began excavating in 1900 and uncovered the palace's most famous room, the throne room. Then in 1908 he found the second entrance. Here it is. He thought he'd found the way in and out of the maze, and to prove it, he placed a bull's head right in the center. Look, there's one bull, two bulls, 3, 4, 5. Okay, maybe there were too many bulls. But Evans believed he had solved the mystery of the labyrinth. Knossos was in the news around the world. People came from everywhere to see it. They marveled at the palace and its treasures. But something didn't feel right. Something didn't fit. The more that Evans uncovered, the more the palace seemed like a normal building instead of a mysterious labyrinth. So he packed up his things and went home. Knossos was put in the hands of a new team. Today, we know Knossos as one of the greatest palaces of the ancient world. We've found frescoes that are still colorful after 3,000 years. We've found the oldest known depiction of an artist at work. We've found roads, shrines, a cemetery, a whole city under one roof. But we haven't found the labyrinth. The maze may never be found. But who cares? Knossos is still amazing. Thank you for watching. It's one of the most famous myths in the world. A half-man, half-bull, a maze that no one escapes. Only Theseus, guided by a thread, returns. But where did this story begin? Hi everyone, welcome to this channel. Today we're headed to the Mediterranean. The great palaces of Knossos, Phaistos and Malea are waiting. But what are we looking for? What's the connection between those magnificent ruins and the labyrinth? If you've visited Knossos, you'll know the palace has no walls. This was typical of Minoan architecture. Their buildings were made of wood and brick, not stone. That meant they could be beautiful, but they were also temporary, and nowhere near the palace walls. A young boy named Theseus would have grown up hearing stories. of a great king who united the people of the north and the south, King Minos. King Minos ruled over a vast domain. His ships controlled the sea, his armies controlled the land, and his wealth came from tribute, which is why when Minos heard of a great white bull on the island of Marathon, he wanted it for himself. But the bull belonged to Poseidon, god of the sea, and the god was angry. So Poseidon caused Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, to fall in love with the bull, and she became pregnant. When Minos learned of his wife's infidelity, he decided he needed to punish her. So he called on the architect Daedalus to design a prison, a labyrinth with one entrance and no exits, a place where anyone could easily become lost. Then the king locked the monster his wife bore inside, and no one ever escaped until Theseus came. But let's go back to the beginning. In the center of the great palace at Knossos, archaeologists found a small shrine room with a bench, a throne, and an altar. Here every morning, priests would have burned incense and made offerings to the gods. But who were they praying to? We don't know. What we do know is that the Minoans kept bulls. They bred giant, powerful animals for sacrifice. At Malia, archaeologists found a fresco showing men leaping over horned beasts. It's called a bull leap, and this may have been part of a ritual procession, maybe even a celebration of spring. The point is, the Minoans loved their bulls. They revered them. So when the Greeks came to Crete, they saw all of these rituals and they thought they were barbaric. The Greeks saw the Cretans as elegant and refined, yet somehow alien. Maybe that's why the earliest written account of the Minotaur comes from a Greek poet named He wrote about King Minos and the monster he imprisoned. And he also wrote about King Rhesus and the great labyrinth he built to house the beast. But remember, the Greeks didn't know anything about Knossos or the other palaces, because they weren't here yet. What Strabo saw were ruined. He visited a deserted island, or so he thought. But when he looked around, all he could see were empty palaces. Empty except for the evidence of a vibrant culture that had vanished. So what does that mean for our story? Maybe the Minotaur wasn't a monster, but a metaphor, a symbol of the power the king once wielded. Maybe the labyrinth wasn't a prison, but a temple, a place of worship where rituals like the bull leap took place. We don't know what happened to the Minoans, but we do know that when the Greeks arrived, they found a culture unlike their own. A culture that had no walls but still managed to thrive. They found huge palaces made of perishable materials, but filled with priceless works of art. They found evidence of a people who lived in harmony with nature, who respected the bulls that gave them food and taught them how to farm the land. They found all of this and more on the island of Crete, where the great Minoan civilization once flourished. Thank you for watching. The history of an idea is not beneath us. It's all around us, all around me. Knossos wasn't just architecture. It was ritual. Shrines, horns, snake goddesses, sacred animals, sacred rhythms. The bull wasn't feared. It was revered. Bull leaping wasn't sport, it was ceremony. Young bodies in motion, an offering to something older, deeper. The labyrinth wasn't walls. It was meaning. 1,000 rooms designed not just to confuse, but to invoke. Myths weren't written here. They were lived. It took centuries to build. Longer still to understand, and now it's gone again. So much of what we think we know about ancient Crete is wrong. I mean, look at this palace. When they first uncovered it, they thought it was King Minos' palace. That's what they called it. King Minos' palace. But by the time they'd finished excavating, they had to admit it wasn't a palace at all, it was a shrine. I came here with questions, but all I got were more questions. How does a civilization produce such perfect stone hinges, yet leave their cities vulnerable to invasion? Why did they build their shrines on hillsides, their palaces on riverbanks? What were they trying to accomplish? Why did the oldest human settlements tend to be built around water? And why did they stop? I think there's a relationship between the sacred and the practical, a balance between innovation and tradition. There are 3 Knossos palaces, old, middle, and new. The old one burned down after 300 years. The middle one flooded after 150 years. And the new one just kind of ran out of steam after another 300 years. Just like today, people back then needed houses, roads, sewers, public buildings, defensive walls, but also shrines, rituals, ways of honoring the deep, the really deep. In order to build Knossos, you had to bring enough people together, organize them into platoons, coordinate their efforts over the course of decades. But it wasn't just work, it was worship. This bull isn't just a symbol, it's a life form. It's alive and well, and charging through the Cretan countryside. I imagine young men coming of age wrestling bulls, not to tame them, but to commune with them, to become them for a moment. You see, the bull wasn't feared, it was revered. These young men were performing an ancient rite of passage. They weren't trying to win a prize. They were serving something greater than themselves. The most famous example is that of a who leapt over the horns of a sacrificial bull in a single bound. Instead of a crown, he wore a wreath of olive leaves. He didn't rule a kingdom. He tended a vineyard. His was the rare privilege to live among the immortals, to dine with the gods. But how did he get there? Was it strength or skill? No, it was pure heart. The Greeks believed that the bull represented the divine, and to overcome the bull was to overcome oneself. It was a metaphor for conquering one's own mortality. That's why Asterius sacrificed the bull. To become immortal, he had to kill the thing that made him immortal. Makes sense, right? Not really. It's a mystery. All we can know for sure is that it was a ceremony. I want to feel what it felt like to live here. Walk the same paths, climb the same stairs, breathe the same air. To do that, you have to let go of everything you think you know. You have to empty your mind and be open to something else, something more. That's when you realize that Knossos wasn't just a ceremonial center, it was a school. Look at these pillars. Do they remind you of anything? Maybe a pair of legs, maybe a dancer, maybe the god Apollo. Turns out, that's exactly what they are. Legs and feet, symbols of the divine. That's because every column here represents a god. This is a temple to multiple deities. They come from all over the Aegean, from every polis, from every tribe. This place was a pilgrimage site. At its peak, Knossos served as a kind of university, a place where young men came to study under the masters, where they learned to read the signs, interpret the myths, decipher the messages from the gods. Then they went home and taught others what they learned here. They've spread the teachings like seeds to the north, to the east, to the south, across the Mediterranean. Knossos became the epicenter of Minoan culture. It was the heart of a civilization. But civilizations don't last forever. Knossos fell, was buried, forgotten, then every time we find a new piece, a fresco, a tablet, a ritual object changes our understanding of the Minoans. Who were they? Where did they come from? What happened to them? The truth is, the deeper we dig, the more questions we find, not answers. And yet there's something deeply satisfying about it. See, civilizations aren't just about buildings. They're about ideas. Ideas about the world, about other worlds, about gods and monsters, about heroes and villains, about life and death and everything in between. The Minoans left behind the grandest collection of stories ever told, and we call them myths. But the Greeks knew them as fact. They didn't write them down. They lived them. Around 1400 BCE, it all ended, no one knows how. Eruption, invasion, collapse from within. Then the Mycenaeans arrived. The art changed. The script changed. The spirit shifted. But Knossos didn't scream, it whispered, it faded. The palace became a shadow, and then a myth. For 3 millennia, the Minoans thrived on this island. They built impressive palaces. They created amazing art. They had a script, not unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs. They worshipped the mother goddess. Their bulls were sacred. Their kings were powerful. Their women, they ruled alongside their men. They excelled at sea. They traded with the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. They may have even sailed to the Americas. Who knows? What we do know is that around 1400 BCE, their great palaces were abandoned. Why? No one knows. But around that time, the Mycenaeans arrived. They came from the north. They brought their language, their customs, their gods, and their alphabet. They adapted the Linear A script into Linear B, which was more like Egyptian hieroglyphs. They continued to build in the old palaces and make art in the old styles for a while. But slowly, everything changed. The art, the script, the very spirit of the place. Then it stopped. Knossos was buried under centuries of debris, under earthquakes and invasions and time. It slept until 1900 when Sir Arthur Evans rang the bell that woke it up. He uncovered the palace and with it the art, the script, the spirit. What did he? Some say he found nothing but bull bones and a drainage pipe. Others say he invented an entire civilization. Some say he stole the artifacts and forgeries from the local peasants. Others say he single-handedly deciphered Linear A. Some say he restored Knossos to its former glory. Others say he rewrote its history. We don't know what's true or what's false because Knossos doesn't remember. It whispers, it fades, it's a shadow, it's a myth, it's a dream, it's gone. Except that here, in this corner of the Aegean, where three great civilizations met and mingled, where the Orient and the Occident embraced, where the sea whispered secrets to the ancient ones, where the first European city was built, where the great palaces of Knossos and Phaistos and Malia once stood, except that here, in this corner of the Aegean, the Minoan spirit still lives. It lives in the ruins of the palaces, in the artifacts scattered across Europe, in the myths and legends of the Greeks, in the tales of the bull-headed Asteria and the memory of a people who thrived on an island that was swallowed by the sea. Throughout history, there have been many ways to break a wall, but if you're going to do it in style, you can't go wrong with a good old-fashioned siege. Whether it was the glorious fall of Constantinople or the slightly less glorious fall of London, sieges are one of the most spectacular ways for an army to meet its match, and no siege engine has captured the imagination quite like the battering ram. The first rams were probably just regular old trunks, invented around 2400 BCE in Mesopotamia. These are basically just logs with pointy bits attached to the end. They might have looked cute, but they were surprisingly effective at smashing through wooden gates. But bigger, stronger gates required bigger, stronger rams. Enter the Ash, a massive multi-person cart with a massive multi-person ram at its front. While the design varied over the centuries, most followed the basic blueprint of a long wooden pole attached to a large mass of iron at its end. The larger the ram, the more people it took to swing it, and the further it could smash, and when it smashed, it really smashed. Most medieval city gates weren't built to withstand repeated hits, so after a few solid blows from a war ram, they were usually done for. Of course, you can't just run up and smash a gate with a giant log. Even if you could, your fellow soldiers would probably get annoyed. So, siege warfare developed alongside fortification countermeasures like the moat, the portcullis, and the motor hole. One way to avoid getting murdered was to simply hurl your ram into the moat. The Assyrians were known for their massive iron-tipped war rams, which could punch through wooden gates and stone walls alike. The Romans would take this idea and kick it into overdrive. Their rams were so powerful that they didn't even need to be wielded by a team of oxen. They were simply wheeled into position, anchored, and then launched via a giant catapult. By the Middle Ages, catapults had become a common sight during siege. These machines used a combination of levers, pulleys, and weights to fling objects over a castle wall. Originally designed to hurl rocks in large boulders, they quickly gained a sinister reputation for launching anything that could fit in the basket, including heads but sometimes even deceased corpses. This versatility made them a popular choice for both offense and defense. Catapults were so common that every medieval army had its own, and although they're not as iconic as the battering ram, they may have been even more effective. But catapults were complicated machines. They required many skilled engineers to assemble and operate, and they weren't always very accurate. That meant that there was room for improvement. Enter the trebuchet, a new kind of catapult that replaced ropes and pulleys with a simpler counterweight-driven mechanism. This made it much easier to launch large projectiles over long distances, often in excess of 100 meters. Trebuchets weren't as fast as catapults, nor were they particularly subtle weapons. But what they lacked in speed and finesse, they made up for in sheer destructive power. A well-aimed stone the size of a small cow could smash through a gate with ease and bring down an entire tower with a single blow. This made them a terrifying addition to any siege, as the defenders had no way to predict where the next rock would land. This unpredictability gave trebuchets a certain majesty, a quality that has made them famous in works of fiction and legend. In fact, the ultimate fate of entire cities seemed to hinge on these massive machines. When defending Constantinople in the 1450s, the Ottoman Turks used a gigantic trebuchet named Philosophel to batter the city walls. Legend has it that the massive machine shot a stone so accurately that it landed inside a gunpowder store, blowing up and bringing down a large section of the city wall. Although the Byzantines held off the Ottomans for another 200 years, it was hard to argue that this siege wasn't a turning point in history. Trebuchets continued to be used throughout Europe until the 16th century, and they saw action as late as the 18th century in China. But as gunpowder became more common, siege engines became less necessary. Cannons could shoot further and do more damage while remaining mobile, and although nothing said doom quite like the battering ram, the trebuchet was the king of the siege. The year is 1266. 5 long years. King Louis IX of France has been laying siege to the English city of Rochester. His objective: capture the castle and bring an end to this humiliating war. All that stands between him and victory is this: a thick stone wall, 30 feet tall, topped with an equal height of Crete. And the defenders a mere handful of men, women and children armed with bows and arrows and whatever else they can find. It seems like a hopeless task, but Louis isn't giving up. In fact, he's just gotten a very big delivery. These are siege towers, 180 feet tall, 30 feet wide at the base, tapering to a point at the top. They're made of wood, metal, and stone, filled with soldiers and equipped with catapults, ballistae, and every other kind of siege engine imaginable. As they roll towards the city, the attackers climb to the top, letting out a battle cry and begin raining down arrows on the helpless defenders. But as the towers approach the wall, the defenders respond with their own surprise attack. From the top of the wall, they drop barrels of boiling oil and vinegar onto the towers, forcing them to halt their advance. Then, as the attackers try to figure out what's happening, they unleash a volley of returning arrows. The defenders take their revenge on those unfortunate enough to be caught in the open. As the siege continues, the attackers add more and more engines of war, along with one very special item, a battering ram. With it, they smash against the gate until it breaks, allowing the attackers to pour through and lay waste to the city, but not before the defenders set off a hidden charge, collapsing the tunnel and killing or injuring many of the attackers. And so the battle for Rochester Castle rages on, in the air, on the ground, and now beneath the earth itself. We don't know exactly how many people died during the siege, but we do know that when the castle finally fell and Louis IX entered the city, he was greeted by a sight that made him regret his victory. There were corpses everywhere, piled up outside the walls, littering the streets, even floating in the river. It was a Pyrrhic victory, to say the least. In the end, though, it was a victory for the French and a devastating loss for the English, and all because these guys got a little too cocky. To learn more ways that sieges went wrong, stay tuned for more information. When someone or something threatened the city, the defenders would fight back with all their might. They hurled boiling oil and fire onto the attackers below. They tossed sand that burned beneath their armor. They even had a weapon called Greek fire, which shot flames that burned even on water, and historians still don't know how they did it. There were also sieges of the mind. Sometimes it wasn't the thickest wall that fell, but the spirit of the people within, when all hope seemed lost, when starvation and disease were taking their toll, and the enemy was at the gates. Someone, somewhere would raise a white flag and shout, "Hold us, surrender," and then came gunpowder. With it, the game changed. Massive cannons rolled up to the city walls and smashed them to pieces. Trebuchets, catapults, and battering rams became relics of the past, but their spirit lives on in every bomb and every missile, in every siege of silence. The walls may fall, but the siege remains. You can feel it when someone takes away your right to speak, to think, to be, when they try to make you forget who you are, where you come from, and everything you've ever known. Because that's what a siege is. It's not just about bombs and bullets. It's about cutting off all escape, all hope, all supplies, and breaking the human spirit. For centuries, sieges were about taking a city. Today, they're about taking away a people's voice. We see it when children are killed trying to cross a border in the hope of a better life, when people are put in cages, when families are torn apart, when rights are taken away and people are made to disappear. But there is hope. There's always hope. Because the spirit of those who fought and died for freedom is with us still. Every act of courage, every step towards justice, every cry for freedom echoes the hopes of those who came before us, and like them, we will not be silenced.